Welcome to the first book launch discussion of the second quarter of the semester at Huron. We're very delighted to welcome you here under difficult circumstances with what's happening with the access strike, but also here at the Institute. This past week we've lost one of our colleagues, Odendaal, and I think we just like to start with a moment of silence and also like to give the floor to our director, Dr. Devan, to say a few words.
It is good to be restarting the semester, but also quite sad to be restarting the semester with quite bad and tough news with the strike, but also that we lost a very dear colleague on the last 2 Saturdays away, back 29, who unfortunately a vehicle accident. In fact, this is the first semester. This is the first seminar of the second semester, and usually he will be here making fun. We do remember him with a lot of laughter. He was a very silly person, and whatever he did really made us laugh. He, for us, was really a person of really good value and good example. He came from a very difficult background, a disadvantaged background from Kailisha Native University, who was teaching fellow on our Andrew Mellon Foundation grant, which is held by the faculty for teaching, turning the tide, which is a grant to grow the next generation of Black South Africans, in academia, and have the privilege, of benefiting from that grant, but also really being an example, growing from a very difficult space where he did not have access to the kinds of both social and cultural capital that are important to be able to operate in an academic space. Over time, he actually became a pillar and a person around whom we commune a lot. So the funeral is going, the memorial of Salvatore family will happen this week on Wednesday, which is also a public holiday. And family will be sending us details about the funeral plans that will happen in Cape, where he came from. But we wishing colleagues, sending our condolences to colleagues at the institute, in the faculty, to the students in the Department of Music, and also those that he was working with at CHEC on the academic development program. Really our deepest condolences. And we are working with the Department of Music to plan the UCT memorial service for him. And we are going to be communicating details about that. But he will be missed by colleagues, lots of colleagues and lots of friends, just because of who he was. He was a really special person. Really We have expressed our thanks to his family for the gift of him to us, because quite often we have a child, and the child is even better of a kind of a child. The parents don't know a lot about him apart from the early life. Most of his life was with us, and we really appreciate the family for giving him to us.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And I just want to welcome everyone again to this seminar with Prof. Nancy Odendaal. We're very delighted to have you here because one of the key themes that HUMA works around is what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be human in Africa today, and with the ideas of disobedience and epistemic disobedience. I think disruption kind of emerges as that. So I would just first like to introduce you, Prof. You are at the School of Architecture, Science and Geomatics at UCT. You're also the current head of the school. Prof. Nancy Odendaal was trained as an urban planner and developed keen interest in contemporary cities very early in her career, focusing primarily on the relationship between urban infrastructure, spatial transformation, and livelihoods. Her recent research has focused on smart urbanism and its manifestation in African cities. Nancy is engaged in a number of networks in Africa and internationally. She is past chair of the Association of African Planning Schools, as well as the Global Climate Education Association Network, and currently is a member of the review committee of the Swiss National Science Foundation SPIRIT program. Very much congratulations for your publication.
Thanks.
And can't wait to hear about the book, Disruptive Urbanism.
Great, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Amina. Can everybody hear me? I have myself muted, but I think it depends on what goes on.
You are unmuted.
Okay, I'm unmuted, okay. Well, first of all, my condolences to you and your colleagues for the loss of your friend. It's indeed very sad when when anyone passes on, but especially when a young, talented person from modest means kind of passes on so prematurely. Right, so again, thank you for the opportunity to actually be able to talk to you about this book. It was a real labor of love and a culmination of a number of years in which I'd been thinking about technology in cities. I mean, I trained as a city planner, and I guess I've been trained to continuously find solutions to urban problems. I mean, that's the nature of our training. And I think what's interesting about the sort of work on technologies in cities is that smart cities are sort of touted to be the kind of ultimate solution to city issues. And this is something I've always questioned in a lot of my work. So, I mean, the inspiration for the book comes from years of research on smart cities, and pretty much smart cities from the bottom up, where I've always, starting with my PhD, which I completed in 2010 at WIPS, where I sort of, in the sort of mid-2000s, I became quite curious as to how people use technologies, especially mobile phones, in their everyday lives in the city and how they negotiate the city. And I'm sort of well aware of the fact that I'm not an anthropologist, as some of you probably are, so I'm feeling vaguely insecure. But what I have found quite fascinating is just how, as technologies evolve and mature, people's livelihoods and the way that they've appropriated technologies have kind of adapted as well, and in quite innovative ways sometimes. So I was drawn to platforms in particular more recently when I was asked to speak at a conference in 2019 in Kampala at it was a geopolitics seminar. And I found myself kind of in the middle of a skirmish between the COO of Safe Border, which is a Ugandan ride app for border riders. For those of you, you probably know that what borders are. What's happening? Yeah. Right. I mean, there is so much that's wrong with a smart city, given the events of the last 1.5 minutes. Okay, folks. So yeah, I mean, I think let me just move to the next slide. So my work is really on this book was informed by I was intrigued by digital platforms and how they manifest in African cities. And I'd recently been working with Alessandro Origi on an edited volume where we looked at designing smart for better cities. And we were particularly taken with how there's a kind of myriad of initiatives that happen in cities across the world where people are kind of appropriating technologies towards making better places. And so that was the big emphasis of our book. And then with this book, I was really keen to sort of get under the skin of cities and get a real insight into how the sort of, yeah, how these kind of platforms, which we tend to, I mean, a lot of the literature on digital platforms are quite sort of worrying about the platform economy, who gets left out, how's the platform economy sort of impacting on governance, for example. And of course, all those debates are really important, but I was more curious about how platforms kind of manifest in cities towards solving urban problems. A big part of my work is also I've done quite a bit of work on case study research. So I'm quite intrigued by the intellectual power of storytelling, and I've always been very intrigued by the politics of infrastructure, and particularly smart infrastructures. And I've certainly worked with scholars across many disciplines on a lot of this work. So the book essentially is, and my friend Stephen Graham was very kind to sort of give a write-up, give a little blurb on for the back book cover on this, saying exactly this, in the sense that the book really challenges the notion of the smart city and the platform economy in a way that it basically asks the question: if the smart city makes all these kind of profound promises about how to remake our cities, what actually is it promising? What is it actually trying to tell us? What is it good at? And how are platforms implicated in that? And up to this point, and this is captured in a lot of the first and the second chapters of my book, a lot of my publications are quite critical of the kind of the big smart city idea. And the image that you see on your screen is this kind of these images that are often used to promote corporate smart cities and corporate smart city storytelling. And there's a kind of technological determinism to a lot of these accounts, that the power of technology is a transformative agent of change. And mostly it's a discourse. I mean, mostly it's a discourse like eco-cities, for example, that is also sometimes a threat to livelihoods. I think we've seen with the 100 Smart City campaign under Modi in India, where whole communities have been moved to make way for essentially new towns. I mean, as an urban planner, I'm always intrigued by the fact that in planning history, there's been this kind of constant renewal of the utopia idea. As urban planners, we completely romanced by it. And I think the smart city idea is yet another kind of utopian ideal that's being kind of pushed as a means to solving urban issues. But like I said, not much clarity on what exactly the smart city should be solving. Very little relation to the existing city, as you can see. I remember once going to Lagos and started sort of standing on the edge of Bar Beach and looking at this big image of Eco Atlantic and looking behind me and going, no. And then, often smart is code for gated estates in edge cities, especially in East Africa. I mean, if we look at smart city in Africa, it's often a mix of the old and the new. This is a picture that I took in Kibera in Nairobi. Map Kibera is an interesting project where it kind of takes a hybrid approach to information sharing and digital and online and on-site and online mapping. Often smart technologies are entangled with livelihoods and lifestyles, incorporated into urban practices. It's often hybrid. So what's shaping cities per se are not the technologies per se, but despite the claims and corporate visions to the contrary, but the interface between technology and users. So what makes platforms really interesting in this regard is that, as Sarah Barnes writes in her brilliant book from 2019, and this person is not a city planner, she's an HCI person, human computer interface person, a scholar who's based in Melbourne. But she talks about how engaging with platform services today is an integral part of being an urban citizen, and as such involves many different kinds of value sharing, not only the value extracted by technology companies, and also the technology, the platform architecture does allow for an interesting kind of distributed agency, which I felt was worth uncovering. And what I mean by that is that the technology architecture allows for add-ons, which kind of yields some really interesting results. So what I do with the book, after kind of smashing the smart city idea and sort of exploring what an African smart city, essentially does look like, is I then say, well, if the smart city is making all these promises, how does the bottom-up kind of approach, or the bottom-up or spontaneous sort of technology-led stories, how do these stories actually show us that there's a groundswell of initiatives that are actually starting to address issues in African cities that the smart city has not actually done thus far, that the whole corporate discourse hasn't done? So I divide the book into four substantive themes, where I look at mobility as a big issue that plagues many, many cities, not just African cities, food security, civic activism, and then public culture. And I use these themes as kind of structuring devices to then tell stories, to essentially capture vignettes of technology appropriation or platform appropriation across the continent that speak to these themes. So I like the word vignette as a person who does quite a lot of work on the methodology of case study research. I most definitely could not call them case studies because they were not each one of them done in huge detail, but they essentially accounts, illustrations, if you like, that together sort of start giving us a picture of what platform urbanism looks like in African cities. So I don't have to tell you, my colleagues at HUMA, that what a big continent this is and how one can't generalize across it. But I nevertheless, and I certainly don't claim to make any great generalizations, and the book doesn't try to do that. But what I did is I did hop on a couple of planes, and a lot of these stories were documented not just in the run up to the book proposal, which by the way is in early 2020, it was just before the world came to a standstill. But a lot of it is also based on work that I had done elsewhere or at other times. But in East Africa, for example, I looked at ride-hailing apps in Uganda. I looked at Safe Border, which is a local, as I've said, ride-hailing app for border riders. For those of you who don't know what borders are, I don't know if I actually got to complete my sentence previously, but they're basically motorcycle taxis. They essentially would be described, I guess, by transportation engineers as paratransit, which of course right now in this moment in time in this city is a very interesting thing to think about. I also looked at Beba, which was a ride-hailing app developed in Nairobi by Ride Hailers Association, and Little Cab. I looked at, so that obviously falls under mobility. And then in Cape Town, I became quite intrigued, and this is during lockdown, by the Cape Town Together movement, the community action networks that were formed during the hard COVID lockdown, and had a sort of look at Yebo Fresh, which is also a food sort of value chain app. But actually, the other vignette that I talk about under food security is also Twiga, which is again a value chain app that essentially connects small-scale farmers on the outskirts of Nairobi with informal vendors in the city, and so that I found quite an intriguing story to tell. And then, and this is by no means exhaustive. I looked at a number of examples. I was intrigued by the way that Ndufunu Kwazi uses their social media campaigns together with their on-site mobilization campaigns towards essentially inclusionary housing and social spatial justice. And so that was in the civic activism chapter. And then sorry, I've just lost my cursor for a minute. There's too much going on in this slide, that's why. As I say to my students, never crowd your map too much. Teach what you need to learn, Nancy. And then Matt Cabrera is actually a case, an example, a case study actually that I'd written about previously. And then also the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center and how it uses platforms in Sierra Leone and specifically in Freetown around, also around sort of addressing informality as a kind of policy issue with local councils is also another example that I looked at. So like I said, these are not the only ones, there are others, but the whole point was to tell these stories and then come up with conclusions on what situated digital platforms look like in African cities. I mean, I must also say that what sits underneath all of this is an approach to, with sensibility, a lens, if you like, conceptual framework that is highly relational. So I'm sort of an urban planner who works in science and technology studies, essentially. So I was quite keen to also use this book as a vehicle to kind of start exploring what post-colonial science and technology studies could look like. It's an area of research, or it's a body of literature that is fascinating. I mean, there's some interesting gender issues explored by people like Sandra Harding. But I think it's something that I found was quite unexplored with regards to smart technology. So I was quite keen to kind of pick that up in the book. So that's just an outline of the book. Kind of starts with an intro and then sort of talks about, I kind of get into the woods with regards to kind of platforms and the architecture of platforms and how they allow for what I call a distributed agency. And then there's mobility, the 4 substantive chapters, mobility, the food, security chapter, the chapter around cyborg activism, and then the public culture chapter, in which I got a little bit fanciful and started playing with the idea of Afrofuturism towards the end, which to me seemed a fitting kind of conclusion to the book's substantive kind of chapters. And then I conclude on how do we then understand situated platform urbanism through a kind of post-colonial SDS lens. And these are and this is to which I turn now. I never asked how long I need to speak for. I mean, is there a bit more time left?
We can still have 10 minutes.
Okay.
After which we'll open to Q&A.
Okay.
Should be done by around 2.
Okay, no, that's cool. I'm hanging on and I'm sort of wondering if I'm not. Okay. Right, so in relation to kind of then using these kind of vignettes to come up with, I guess, what are propositions around situated platform urbanism in African cities. I mean, I should also say, obviously, a lot of my work is also informed by Southern urbanism. I mean, I'm quite closely associated with the African Center for Cities. So yeah, there's a kind of mix of influences. I mean, the one thing, and this is not just because I'm an urban planner, but the one thing that stood out really, really clearly to me was the importance of space and place in relation to all 4 of the themes and the vignettes contained therein. The photo here is of a stage, a border stage in Kampala. So what a stage essentially is a place where border riders congregate, and there's an institutional backbone to it. That actually that is a form of governance of kind of border associations, and what I found quite interesting in doing my interviews in Kampala is this kind of unease with digital platforms is actually undermining the stages and everything surrounding those stages. And the notion of space and place just came up, well, especially place an attachment to place came up over and over again. The second proposition is really, it's these terms that get used quite, I'm wondering what my notes are saying there, but these terms that get used quite interchangeably, flow and connection. But what I found of particular value is just, and this is drawing from people like Abdul Malik Simone and, in his work on social infrastructure, it's just this kind of continuous flow of, obviously, of information, of capital, but also the kind of connective tissue that often underpins these initiatives. The sort of the social the livelihood structures that connect and yet sort of interface in quite interesting ways with a kind of digital connectivity enabled through platforms. And there's these kind of flows that I think are really important, and obviously kind of changing over time. I found issues around governance and regimes very fascinating, especially around the border riders and safe border. So what you have is a couple of layers of governance issues. So you have a body of motorcycle riders that are actually quite a strong political constituency, and there's some really interesting work on this. And then it's a political constituency that is often seen as posing a threat to the existing regime. And then on top of it, you now have this kind of app that is being developed in essentially a policy and governance vacuum. And I mean, when I was interviewing the founder of Safe Border, Ricky Thompson, I said to him, so, how do you negotiate not only the fact that the Kampala capital city authority is very much anti-border and sees them as very problematic, but then how do you kind of negotiate also on top of that, what's essentially the ride-hailing app and the sort of governance vacuum around that? And he said to me, oh, that's great. It's an opportunity. We kind of negotiated on an ongoing basis, on a day-to-day basis, flow and connection. We just roll with the punches, and we're kind of influencing the policy-making process as we go along. And but then when Safe Border sort of expanded to other country contexts, it was also interesting how it morphed as a response to governance regime. So when it kind of moved to Ibadan in Nigeria, when it moved to Nairobi, it's no longer in Nairobi. It simply had the kind of architecture of the platform had to change and had to morph to actually fit the qualities of place, but also the qualities of the nature of the governance system that it sort of spoke to. I did some work on drones in Tanzania, and in the interviews there was this kind of same notion of, well, there's a policy vacuum. Here's an opportunity. We can write the policy collaboratively. I'm sure it's not that easy, but I think what was fascinating about that is the kind of bricolage that was implied. The sort of the constant negotiations that were sort of spoken of. And then I found, especially looking at the work by the community action networks as a response to COVID, quite fascinating in terms of trust and continuity. There was what the Cape Town Together movement did is they came up with a manifesto, and this happened very quickly, called the CAN ways of working. So the whole idea is that for those of you perhaps not familiar with the CANs, I'm sure most of you are, but the whole idea was to kind of essentially form these neighborhood groups that would kind of respond to community needs, whether it's food insecurity or whether it's access to data, to be able to cope. So trust and continuity. And then I make a final sort of conclusion around, it's not the smart city, it's the hybrid city. It's a mix of on-site, online, technical, non-technical, community networks. It's a hybrid of strategies that kind of get combined to respond to very place-specific issues. And I mean, the book ends off on quite a hopeful note. And I have been subject to a lot of critique, especially from Marxists, about my book, because my work is, my work is always, and I think it comes from being a city planner, you're always wanting to, identifying the problem is never enough. You want to come up with a solution. But I do believe that there's what's interesting about, I would say, almost all those vignettes is this kind of the sense of hope and engagement with technology on the continent's own terms, which I find very, very hopeful. Disruptive, definitely disruptive, but also quite hopeful. But I think I have about 50 seconds left. So as you can tell, the first review is in. It's not entirely favorable, but yeah, thank you. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. I think it was really piquing a lot of curiosities, and when I read the introduction, there's a word that really caught my attention, which was speculation, and how you suggest that, or you're proposing that the book is a speculative book. And I would love if you could perhaps expand on how do you situate the speculation between the imagined city and your analysis versus the reality of what's happening? How can we sort of think about?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that very last slide, not the one with my cat, sorry, it was a bit cheeky, but the one before that about hopeful futures, I mean, that in itself is speculative. I mean, the word speculative is actually, that's actually very, very insightful, because the word speculative is quite central to a lot of corporate smart city initiatives. I mean, it is about property speculation. It's about Africa is the next frontier, for capital, big capital investment. So the speculative nature of smart cities is something that I'm well aware of, and people like the late Vanessa Watson has done some wonderful work on that. But I think, I mean, I think where the two perhaps meet is around hope and alternative futures. How do we? I'm sure I'm not really answering your question very well, but how? I mean, when I look at these images that come from the corporates around smart cities, I mean, to me, there's a kind of slight glimmer of, let's work towards something that works, that is almost like seamless, because that's what technology sort of says. You can kind of move through the world seamlessly, and we all know that that's not how you move through cities like Kampala and Cape Town. I guess my speculative sort of dimension, well, my speculative intention with this book is really to unsettle the notion of disruption, and I mean, in the same way that technology disruption is touted to be something good for the economy and progressive and, and sort of serving capital in many ways. I mean, I'm sort of saying, well, these initiatives are disruptive in different ways. And I guess unsettling the notion of disruption is in itself a kind of a speculative gesture, in the same way as, sort of coming up with these kind of ideas of what our future utopias could look like is kind of also is obviously very speculative. It's not a great answer to your question, but I think it could get the discussion rolling.
I would also like to open the floor if anyone has a question. Feel free. online. If you have a question, feel free to send it through.
Carolina, congratulations.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Dominique. It's always so lovely to see you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really, I think you responded to one. Utopia, smart, great. And the second is really around studies of cities or cities on the continent. And also the south, also the notion of southern urbanism. Why is it so much focused on the poor?
That's great.
Yeah, because if I'm focusing on smartness, if you want Zurich, for example, talking about like smart cars, you train and lots of other stuff. But once it comes to content, I'm going to look for poverty. You know, so why is it that studies of cities on the continent really is oriented towards poor, poverty, solve lots of issues and apps that have been developed for poor people to work with, not necessarily for the wealthy to think about how to distribute their wealth.
Yeah.
I would love to have an app to calculate how much money you have to distribute it to other people. You know, why is it so much money? Why are we attracted?
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, there's some wonderful work on the middle class. I'm not muted. Am I muted?
Just avoid.
Sorry. I mean, there's some great work on the middle class in African cities. I'm thinking of Charlotte Lemansky, but I take your point. I mean, the focus is on the poor, because the poor are just. I think it's largely. Oh, okay. Thanks, Caroline. I think it's largely I think there's two sides to that, to the answer to that question. The one is that urbanization policy in many African countries is largely ignorant of the poor and how the poor survive, and is also quite sort of. There's a tendency to still believe that that urbanization is accompanied by job creation and formalization, when it's actually just not. I mean, informal urbanization is one of the qualities of how cities grow in our continent. So I think it's largely the way in which the informal and the way in which people on the margins are essentially just forgotten about or just ignored by policy. And I think there's a kind of big, obviously a big sort of push to address that. I mean, I think in the literature, it's quite. I mean, African urbanism is also a challenge to mainstream urban studies literatures. It's a challenge that says, you know, not only do not all cities aspire to be European or Anglo-American, but there's something else going on that's worth looking at, that we could actually learn from. And I think that's where the whole push towards Southern urbanism is fascinating, because it's saying it's not just about surfacing the needs of the marginalized and the poor, or the kind of conditions, but it's about saying, well, actually, there's something going on here that we can learn from. And I think that is super important. But it's a legitimate question. I mean, I think it becomes particularly interesting. I mean, there's some really nice work being done at the African Center for Cities on fintech, for example. You know, and how fintech is kind of impacting cities. And I think, there's kind of increasing, especially if we're going to work in the platform and digital spaces, you know, we're going to have to be far more granular in terms of how we kind of engage across across income spectrums.
It's just a photo, actually.
Yeah, no, that's thanks, Tom.
Please just unmute yourself on the
Yeah, so I want to ask one brand question. So would you say there's different object and priorities and interests that you can in your own work and what your colleagues are doing?
Yeah.
In South America or
Yeah. No, that's quite nice. It's quite a nice. It's also it is a really nice follow-on from Divine's question. I mean, there's an interesting range of work. I think my work does well. Not I think I should know. My work does focus on that kind of niche. You know, that kind of little meeting place between livelihood strategies and technology appropriation and spatial change, actually. I mean, I really do look at how spaces change as a result of all of the above. And I think there's Prince Guma, who writes out of Nairobi, sort of does quite similar work, but kind of, and then there's interesting work on fintech, which is emerging. There's really interesting work on the platform economy that I've seen at Wiser. That's beginning to surface as well. The work on India by people like Diganta Das, who very kindly is on the call, who's a friend, and Iona Data, is fascinating in how they look at these kind of big smart city initiatives and the substantive impacts they have on cities, you know, on actual city governance in cities. Then there's some really interesting, I mean, my Spanish is terrible and my Portuguese is non-existent, so I can't speak or say that much about Latin American literature, but what I have come across, I have friends in Brazil who are doing some really interesting work on surveillance, and the kind of surveillance aspects of the digital, of the platform economy, which I think is super important work. A shout out to my friend Rodrigo Firmino. And then the work that I've seen in Colombia, for example, has kind of largely been around governance, you know, sort of governance processes and how smart, and e-governance, I guess. So no, there's an amazing range, and certainly my work is not all encompassing. Sandile, I think you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandile. Yeah.
Incidentally, you've just spoken about surveillance.
We should actually going to be 2 hours.
So that you can speak, so that you can be Dominique. But we know you, Sandile.
Thank you so much. Surveillance, technology for surveillance is quite integral. You see the mistake process when it comes to migrants and so on. South Africa speak a lot about this. Of course, it's not always about cities. One appreciates that. But in a way, one could enter the city, the technology for surveillance coming into effect in different ways. Most of those ways they are very dehumanizing and potentially, a violation of people's human rights.
Yeah.
So how does the smart city respond to that? Secondly, the idea of the rule of law and how the smart city idea also potentially expands our understanding of the concept, the rule of law, the potentialities for abuse and other dangers that come with this ambitious idea of smart city. And of course, the idea of smart city also suggests that what we're coming from or what we're trying to emerge from is not that smart. So even the very same concept is for certain ambitions to a certain degree highly exaggerated, in the context of Southern Africa.
I mean, so again, I believe there's some really interesting work being done by a lot of my colleagues on sort of biometric governance. And I mean, I'm sort of thinking, I think some of Keith Breckenridge's work at Wiser also sort of looks at that. In fact, he wrote a book about that, which I believe is really, really important work, because there's a kind of, we can go back to Foucault, right? There's a kind of governmentality that I believe we can definitely look at a little bit more carefully, that comes with, smart cards, digitization of kind of governance processes, etc. So no, there's definitely a lot of work to be done there. And it's important work, because it speaks directly to, it does speak to human rights. It also speaks to, in a kind of urban studies context, to the right to the city. If the city is now the smart city, and people are excluded by virtue of their, well, it could be, I mean, we sort of moving so quickly with AI, that, I mean, that in itself makes my stomach turn, in terms of the kind of impact that could have on people's rights in the city, and rights to services. Just the fact that you don't have access to some services because you happen not to have a smartphone, for example. I mean, that's the practical side, but there's the kind of deeper side about what happens when that information is captured and what gets done with that information, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to your question. I'm saying to you, it's important work that does need to be done, and it's definitely an issue. Yeah.
There's a question by Caroline on the implications of this work for collective action among informal workers.
So let me put you in the picture. Caroline Skinner is the research director of WeGo. Some of you might be familiar with WeGo. So I was hoping she'd throw me such a juicy question. Yeah, Caroline. I mean, it's so absolutely critical. In fact, when I first did my field work for my PhD in 2005, I think it was. I did a lot of work where I worked with informal traders and tried to understand how they used, in those days it would have been feature phones, just normal mobile phones, to kind of network. And a lot of folks were obviously also foreign, and this was also a time of terrible xenophobic violence in Durban, where I did my research. So there was an interesting kind of couple of layers around information sharing, networking, etc., and of course livelihoods access. But I think that the most exciting sort of work for me coming out of the book is around value chains, and how we can kind of use platforms to enable kind of value chains that are more mindful and more responsive to the economic strategies of informal workers. I also found quite interesting how there were these lots of interesting things. How there were these kind of networks of service providers, like, for example, people working from home doing plain sewing, who then connect up with border riders, and then that connects up with other kind of suppliers. Again, kind of, looking at the value chain and looking at how the platform can serve a value chain that's not necessarily as kind of that is more granular. So that to me is fascinating, especially around looking at Twigger and the way that Twigger works with informal traders in Nairobi. Yes. Oh, thanks, Caroline. Cheers. Thanks, mate.
Thank you so much. I think your last point was, I think what I really got, and also what I'm thinking through for my PhD, is the idea of maintenance. And you speak of these.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's an untapped research market, if I can put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of technologies that travel.
Yeah.
And you say that it's not necessarily about the landing, but it's about how they are maintained on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And it's going back to our social capital.
Exactly.
And I guess also informal workers that make sure that the technology that we deem as smart is in fact maintained by so much human labor that is underpaid and that is invisible. Yeah. Like the invisible technician.
I do in the last chapter, sorry to interrupt you, Amina, but just to quickly throw it out there. In the last chapter, I do start looking at maintenance and reuse as part of the kind of, I guess, the platform economy. But I also believe that is something we need far more work on. I mean, there has been some really nice work on it in Ghana, for example, but I think that's definitely even more so now. It's worth taking forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Divine, and thank you, Amina. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us both online and in the room. This is our first week of back with seminars. On Thursday, there's a conversation with Vito Laterza, and it seems to be a continuation of today's conversation because he's going to be expanding on post-colonial STS, post-humanism, and also surveillance. I think he's going to go into engaging with Don Ide and what's happening in STS in the global north, but also how to bring it back here. So please come through on Thursday if you can at 1 p.m. with Tony, and check our Facebook page for all the other seminars that we have this semester. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's really good.
No, thank you. Thanks for your great questions. They were fantastic. Thank you.
Visit